The telegram had been sitting on Rowan Mercer's kitchen table for 11 days before he finally read it. His sister Clara had sent it from Billings, and he'd known from the handwriting on the envelope that it wasn't going to be anything he wanted to deal with. Clara had a way of deciding things for people and then informing them afterward, as if their opinion was a courtesy she'd already considered and set aside. So the envelope sat there, weighted down by a coffee tin, while Rowan worked the fence line and fed the horses and did everything a man alone on 400 acres needed to do in the shortening days of late September 1882. When he finally opened it, he read it twice. Then he set it down and walked outside and stood in the yard for a long time looking at nothing. Arranged a match for you. Her name is Evelyn Cross, 27 years, from Cincinnati. Decent woman, hard circumstances. Arrives Millhaven Station October 3rd noon train. Don't you dare leave her standing there, Rowan. I mean it. October 3rd was 4 days away. He wrote back immediately. Cancel it. I didn't ask for this. Cancel it now. He wrote into Millhaven himself to send the telegram, paid the extra rate for urgent delivery, and came home feeling like he'd handled it. Claire would be furious. Claire was always furious about something when it came to him. But she would fix it. She would send word to whatever agency or preacher or matchmaker she'd gone through, and the woman, Evelyn Cross, 27, hard circumstances, would be redirected somewhere else, somewhere that wanted her. He didn't hear back. He told himself no news was good news. He told himself Clara had sorted it. He fed the horses, checked the roof joints in the barn for the 3rd time that week, and went to bed 2 nights in a row without eating much. On the morning of October 3rd, he was up before dawn, and by 7 he'd already talked himself into believing the whole thing had been called off. By 10:30 he was saddling the bay. He didn't examine why. He told himself he was going into town for lamp oil and maybe to see if Hendricks at the feed store had gotten that harness buckle in yet. He told himself that. He rode the 6 miles to Millhaven with his jaw set and his coat collar up against the bite in the air, and he arrived at the station with 20 minutes to spare before the noon train. He did not go inside. He stood with his horse at the hitching post across the road and watched the platform from a distance, the way a man watches something he hasn't decided about yet. The train came in 8 minutes late, coughing steam and grinding metal, and passengers began filing out onto the wooden platform. Ranch families, a traveling salesman with too many bags, a young couple who looked like they'd been arguing since Denver. Rowan watched all of it without moving, and then he saw her. She was the last one off. That was the first thing he noticed. Not her face, not her size, just the fact that she waited until everyone else had cleared the steps before she came down herself, one hand gripping the rail, the other hand holding a suitcase that was clearly heavier than she was managing well. It was a single bag, worn at the corners, the kind of bag that told you this was not a woman moving to a new life, so much as a woman escaping an old one. She stepped onto the platform and stood still. Just stood there, looking up and down the length of it. And even from across the road, Rowan could see the moment the platform emptied out, and she understood there was no one waiting for her. Her shoulders didn't collapse. That was the second thing he noticed. A softer woman might have crumpled, might have started crying right there in public, and he wouldn't have blamed her. But this woman just stood with the suitcase at her feet and looked down the road into the town of Millhaven like she was taking stock of what she had to work with. Rowan crossed the road. He didn't decide to. His feet just moved and he was crossing the road, and then he was stepping up onto the platform, and she heard his boots and turned, and that was when he saw her face. She wasn't what he'd expected. He hadn't let himself form much of an expectation, but whatever vague shape had lived in the back of his mind, she wasn't it. She was a plain-faced woman, not the kind of plain that people call pretty in a backhanded way, just plain, broad across the cheeks with dark eyes that had seen something recent and hard and hadn't finished processing it yet. There was a smudge of train soot on her jaw. Her hair was coming loose from its pins in a way that suggested it had been neat when she left and given up somewhere around Wyoming. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're Rowan Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. "Clara sent a telegram," he said. "I sent one back." Something passed through her face. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something she'd already suspected. Sane? Sane to call it off. She looked at him for a moment, then looked down at the suitcase. "She didn't tell me that." "No," Rowan said. She wouldn't. The platform was quiet now. Down at the far end, The station master was moving crates around with no particular urgency. The train was already backing out, heading toward its next stop. "I can find a room," Evelyn said. She said it evenly, not asking him for anything with her tone, just stating a fact. "I have a little money, not much, but I can find a room tonight and figure out the next step." He should have let her do exactly that. He should have tipped his hat and walked back to his horse and ridden home alone the way he'd been doing for 4 years. He knew that. "You came from Cincinnati," he said instead. "Yes." "That's 3 days on a train. 2.5. And before that?" She looked at him more carefully now, trying to figure out what he was doing. "Before that, I was in Cincinnati, working in a laundry. Before that, I was married. Before that—" She stopped. "Is there a reason for these questions, Mr. Mercer, or are you just passing the time?" It was the sharpest she'd been, and it surprised him into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "I have a ranch," he said, 6 miles out, 400 and some acres. I've been running it alone since 1878, and I could use the help." "That's not the same as wanting a wife." "No," he said, "it's not." She picked up the suitcase. He watched her adjust her grip, the weight of it pulling at her shoulder, and didn't offer to take it because she hadn't asked him to. "If I come," she said, "I want to be clear about something." "All right. I'm not coming to be a housekeeper. I'm not coming to cook your meals and wash your shirts and be grateful for the roof. If I work, I work. All of it, not just the inside parts." He thought about the 40 yards of fencing that needed replacing on the east pasture. He thought about the root cellar that wasn't half stocked enough for winter. He thought about every single thing that needed doing and that he had been doing alone and doing half as fast as it needed to get done. "Agreed," he said. She studied him one more moment, the kind of look that was measuring something more than his face, and then she walked toward the hitching post where his horse stood waiting.
Let's say that's busy was opinion.
The ride back to the ranch was almost entirely silent. Evelyn sat behind him on the bay, the suitcase tied across the saddle in front, and Rowan didn't try to fill the quiet with conversation because he'd never been any good at that and didn't see the point of starting now. She didn't try either. The road ran through open grass and scrub pine, and the sky above the Rockies had gone the color of hammered pewter, the kind of sky that meant business. "It gets cold here," he said at one point. "Yes," she said, "early and fast." "I read that." He didn't say anything else. A few minutes later, she said, "Is the house in decent shape?" And he said, "It stands," which was the most honest answer he could give. The ranch came into view around a long curve. The main house first, square and weathered, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that sagged on the left end where a support post had rotted out. Behind it, the barn, a smaller outbuilding, the corral, and beyond all of it, the open slope of pasture running up toward the tree line. He felt her take it in and said nothing. "The post on the porch," she said. "I know. It's not structural or I know," he said again. "I'll get to it." She didn't say anything more about it. He helped her down from the horse, not because she needed it, but because his mother had raised him to do that much at least, and he untied the suitcase and held it out to her. She took it. "Your room," he said, leading her inside. The house was clean in the way that a house is clean when a person lives alone and is not messy by nature but has no one to account to either. Functional. The kitchen table had 2 chairs. The window over the sink let in the afternoon light. It smelled like pine smoke and leather and coffee. He showed her the second bedroom, which had been his wife's sewing room and then nothing for 4 years. There was a bed frame, a mattress that had been kept dry, a washstand, that was all. "I'll bring in a chest," he said. "This is fine." He left her there. Dinner that night was a study in 2 people carefully not making it strange. Evelyn had found the dry goods and put together a pot of beans with salt pork without asking him where anything was, just opening doors and drawers until she found what she needed. He came in from the barn to find the table set, the fire going, and her standing at the stove with her sleeves pushed up. "You don't have to," he started. "I was hungry," she said. "You probably are too." They sat across from each other and ate. The beans were better than what he made, not that he was going to say so. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. So he told her, the acreage, the current herd, where the grazing was best in which season, where the creek ran and where it didn't in a dry year. He told her about the east fence, the root cellar situation, the firewood he still needed to split before November came down from the mountains. He talked about it the way he always talked about the ranch, flatly, practically, as a list of problems to solve. And she listened with her elbows on the table, asking a question now and then that told him she'd understood what he said and had thought one step further. "How many head do you have right now?" she asked. 43. Lost 2 to a cat this summer. Mountain lion. "Yeah, haven't seen it since August, but it'll come back down when the deer thin out." She nodded. Then, "What happened in 1878? He went still. She didn't look away or soften it. "You said you've been running it alone since 1878, so I'm asking." The fire popped. He put his fork down. "My wife and son," he said. "Fever. They were gone inside of a week." He said it the way he always said it when he had to. Flat as a road, because if he let any slope into it, the whole thing ran away from him. His name was Thomas. He was 2 years old. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. It was 4 years ago." "That doesn't change what I said." He didn't answer. He picked up his fork again and finished eating. Later, when he went back out to check on the horses before dark, he stood in the barn for a while in the lantern light, not doing anything in particular. He didn't know what he'd been thinking, bringing her here. He still wasn't sure he'd done the right thing. She was a stranger. The ranch was no place for a stranger, especially not one carrying her own weight of hard circumstances, whatever those were. But she hadn't flinched when he'd said the worst of it. She hadn't reached across and touched his hand or said something about time healing things. She'd just said, "I'm sorry," like she meant it and didn't expect it to fix anything. And then she'd let him come back up for air on his own. That was something, at least. Tian. The next 2 weeks were friction and adjustment, and the slow, grinding work of two people learning to share a space without getting in each other's way. Evelyn was up before he was most mornings, which he hadn't expected. The first time he came out of his room to find the fire already going and coffee on and her out in the yard checking the water trough, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment like he was seeing the house for the first time. He'd gotten used to mornings being a particular kind of quiet. He wasn't sure how he felt about them being different, but the coffee was better than his. She worked hard. That became clear inside the first week. Not performatively hard, not the kind of hard that was looking to be noticed, just genuinely, steadily, without complaint. She asked him questions before doing things she didn't know how to do, how deep to dig a trench for the drainage issue behind the barn, what the horses would and wouldn't tolerate from a stranger, whether the chickens had been wormed recently. She didn't pretend to know things she didn't. When he showed her something she hadn't done before, she paid attention and usually only needed to be shown once. The townsfolk were another matter. The first time Rowan brought her to Millhaven for supplies, he could feel the attention before they were even off the wagon. Word had gotten around the way word always did in a town this small and this empty of entertainment. The Mercer widower had finally sent away for a bride, and here she was. He watched people look at her the way they looked at a new arrival anywhere, with a particular brand of small-town assessment that sorted newcomers into categories fast and kept them there. At the general store, Eleanor Haskins, who made it her life's work to know everyone else's business, looked Evelyn up and down with the patient deliberateness of a woman who had been waiting for this moment. "So you're the new Mrs. Mercer, then," Eleanor said, though they were not yet married, which Eleanor knew perfectly well. "I'm Evelyn Cross," Evelyn said. "Come a long way." "From Cincinnati, yes." "That's a real long way to come," Eleanor said, her tone making perfectly clear what she thought of women who came that far for a man they'd never met. Was there nothing closer to home that suited? Rowan was about to say something, but Evelyn got there first, pleasantly and without heat. "Nothing that needed me the way this did, ma'am." Eleanor blinked. It wasn't the answer she'd been fishing for, and she knew it, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. Rowan paid for the flour and the salt and moved them toward the door before anything else could develop. Outside, he put the bags in the wagon and didn't say anything. "She'll talk," Evelyn said. "She already has been." What are they saying? He considered how honest to be. That you came for an easy life, that you're running from something, that it won't last the winter. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Let them say it," she said. "I'd rather earn my own reputation than argue with someone else's opinion of me." He climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon pulled back out onto the main road. He didn't say so out loud, but he thought, fair enough. By the end of October, the ranch looked different. Not dramatically. Rowan wasn't a man who trusted dramatic changes, but in the small, specific ways that showed something was actually being maintained now. The sagging porch post had been replaced. The root cellar was properly stocked. The east fence, which he'd been meaning to address for 2 months, was done. He hadn't done all of it himself. Evelyn had worked the fence line with him for 3 straight days, pulling wire and setting posts in the hardening ground. And she hadn't complained about the cold or the blisters or the fact that the work was dirty and relentless. On the 3rd afternoon, a post she was driving came loose in soft soil, and she went down hard on one knee, and he helped her up and she said, "I'm fine," and drove the post again. That evening, she admitted her hands were raw enough that she had trouble cutting the supper bread. He gave her the tin of salve from the medicine shelf and didn't make anything of it, and she took it without making anything of it either. The evenings had started to mean something, which he hadn't seen coming. Not in a way he could have explained clearly or that he would have wanted to. Just that there was something different about coming in from the cold to a house with a light in it. About sitting across from someone who could hold up a conversation that wasn't entirely about livestock and weather, though there was plenty of both. She read. She'd brought 3 books in that suitcase, which he respected. And sometimes she read aloud without asking permission. Just started reading while he was cleaning harness leather or going over the accounts, and he found he didn't mind the sound of her voice in the room. She was funny, sometimes. Dry and quiet about it, so that it snuck up on you. The evening one of the horses got into the barn and knocked over half the stored oats, and they spent 45 minutes chasing it back out, she said, entirely deadpan. "I don't know what you were worried about. That went smoothly." He laughed before he thought about it, which surprised both of them. But the past was still there. It was always there, pressed against the walls of the house like weather. There were things he didn't talk about, and places he didn't go. The corner of the bedroom where he'd stored a small wooden toy horse that Thomas had never had a chance to grow too old for. The photograph on the mantel of a woman who had his eyes and a smile he hadn't been able to put away. Evelyn saw the photograph, of course. The first week she had looked at it for a long moment, and then looked away. And she never asked him about it. He appreciated that more than he could say. He wasn't ready to talk about it. Maybe he'd never be ready. He had built a life, a functioning, manageable life, around the fact of his loss, and the architecture of it depended on certain doors staying shut. What he didn't account for was that Evelyn Cross had her own doors. He found out on a rain-soaked Wednesday in early November, when the wind came down from the mountains with real malice behind it and kept them both inside most of the day. He was going over the winter accounts at the kitchen table, and she was mending a split seam in one of the work coats, and for a while there was no sound but the rain on the roof and the scratch of his pencil. Then she said, without looking up from the coat, "I was married before." He looked up. She kept her eyes on her work. "His name was Donald Cross," she said. "We married when I was 22. He was kind at first. Most of them are, I think, at first." She drew the needle through the fabric with the careful attention of someone who needed her hands occupied while her mouth did something hard. "By the time I was 25, he wasn't kind anymore. By the time I was 26, I understood that it wasn't going to get better." Rowan set down his pencil. "He died," she said. "Accident at the factory where he worked. I was sad in the way you're sad when something you were hoping might change doesn't get the chance to change. And then I was other things." She finally looked up. "I came here because I wanted something honest. I wanted to work and know what the work was for. I wasn't running from Donald because Donald was gone. I was running from what I'd been made to think I was worth." He held her gaze. "What were you made to think?" She looked back down at the coat. "Not much." Outside, the rain came harder. The fire crackled and shifted. "That's wrong," he said. She pulled the thread tight. "I know that now." She said it quietly, like she was still in the process of convincing herself. "I know that now." Neither of them said anything after that for a while. But the room felt different, not tighter, the way it might have when 2 people are pretending something didn't happen, but actually lighter, like something heavy had been set down on the table between them and acknowledged, and would not have to be carried the same way anymore. He picked up his pencil. She kept sewing. The rain lasted until dark. Yeet. It was the first week of November when he came back from the south pasture to find her at the chopping block, working through a pile of split wood with a methodical ferocity that told him something had happened. He unsaddled the bay and came out to stand at the fence. She didn't look up. "What is it?" he said. She buried the axe in the block and turned. Her face was flushed, partly from the cold and partly from something else. "I went to the Hendersons today," she said. Henderson ran the nearest neighboring spread 3 miles east to see if Ruth Henderson had the extra mason jars she said she might have. And apparently Mrs. Haskins had been there the day before. She crossed her arms. Ruth was perfectly polite, but she said, very carefully, that she hoped I was thinking long-term about my situation, and that women who came looking for shortcuts sometimes found the frontier harder than they expected. She looked at him steadily. She was kind about it. That almost made it worse. Rowan said nothing for a moment. Then, "What did you say to her?" "I said that I came here to work, and I intended to." Evelyn unfolded her arms and bent to pick up an armful of wood. "And then I came home and started chopping." He watched her carry the wood toward the house. "You know that talking won't fix it," he said. "The way things get fixed around here is by still being here, by the work speaking for itself." She paused on the porch steps, the wood balanced in her arms. "I know that," she said. "I'm not looking for you to fight my battles." "I know you're not." She went inside. He stood in the yard for a minute, looking at the woodpile. She'd split more in an hour than he usually got done in 2. He bent and picked up the axe and worked through the remaining pile himself, not because it needed doing, but because his hands wanted something to hit. What Eleanor Haskins and Ruth Henderson and the rest of them didn't know, what they couldn't see from the safe remove of town, was what it actually took to keep a ranch running when the days were getting short and the cold was coming and there was never enough time. They didn't know about the fence, the root cellar. The 3 mornings Evelyn had been up before dawn to check on a heifer that wasn't behaving right and caught a problem early enough to save the animal. They didn't know about any of it. They would. Eventually. But eventually was a long way off, and November was right now, and Rowan had spent 4 years learning that you didn't get to skip ahead. He split the last of the wood and stacked it against the side of the barn and went inside. She had started supper. He washed up at the basin and sat down, and they ate together in the easy quiet that had become, without either of them planning it, the ordinary shape of their evenings. It wasn't what he'd expected. None of this was what he'd expected. He wasn't sure what to do with that yet, so he did what he always did. He let the work be enough, and the day be enough, and he told himself that tomorrow would come and they would handle whatever it brought, same as they had handled everything else. Outside, the wind picked up. The first real suggestion of the winter to come ran a cold finger under the door. Rowan got up and shoved a towel against the gap at the base of it. Evelyn watched him do it and said nothing, and there was something in the not saying anything that felt, in its own particular way, like a kind of home. The towel against the door didn't hold all night. Rowan found it kicked sideways the next morning, cold air coming in along the floor, and he spent 20 minutes before coffee getting the gap properly sealed with a strip of leather he cut from an old bridle. Small things like that were the actual texture of frontier life, not the grand moments, not the sweeping views of the mountains going pink at sunrise, but the endless negotiation with a structure that was always working against you, always settling, always finding new ways to let the cold in. Evelyn was already outside when he finished. He could see her through the kitchen window at the chicken coop, scattering feed with the same even, unhurried motion she brought to everything physical. She'd figured out the chickens in the first week, which ones were aggressive, which one had the habit of hiding eggs behind the water barrel, which needed watching because it had a tendency to pick at the others. She hadn't announced any of this. He just noticed that the flock was running smoother than it had in a year. He poured his coffee and stood at the window for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he put on his coat and went out to start the day. November came down hard that year, not with the dramatic suddenness of a blizzard, that would come later, but with a slow, grinding pressure, like something leaning its full weight against the season. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first week and didn't come back up. The creek that ran along the north edge of the property developed a skin of ice at its edges that thickened a little more each morning. The horses grew their winter coats ragged and thick and stood closer together in the corral. There was always more work than there were hours to do it in. Rowan had been managing alone for 4 years, and he'd made his peace with the fact that some things didn't get done. You triaged. You fixed what would cost you most if it failed and let the rest wait. But having a second pair of hands, capable, consistent, willing hands, meant that the list he'd been carrying in his head for years was actually getting shorter. It was a strange feeling, almost uncomfortable in the way that relief sometimes was, when you'd been braced so long against a weight that putting it down felt wrong. Evelyn mended the chicken coop roof on a Thursday when he was occupied with the cattle. He came back to find it done, the new boards cut clean and fitted tight, no gaps. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked. "My father," she said. "We didn't have money to hire things out." She was cleaning her hands on a rag, looking at her work with the critical eye of someone checking for what she might have missed. He said if something needed doing and we were capable of doing it, the only reason not to was laziness or pride. Sounds like a practical man. He was. She tucked the rag in her pocket. He died when I was 17. After that, practical was all we had. He didn't push past that. He'd learned already that she answered questions she was ready to answer and let the others sit, and he respected that because he was exactly the same way. What he didn't tell her was that the chicken coop roof had been on his mental list for 8 months. The second week of November, they had their first real argument. It started over something small. Most arguments did, which was the question of whether the south pasture cattle needed to be moved up to the winter grazing area yet, or whether there was still enough grass left to make it worth leaving them another week. Rowan said wait. Evelyn said move them now. "The grass is thinner than it looks," she said. They were standing at the fence line in the gray midday light, both of them looking out at the herd. "They're already competing for the better patches. If we wait a week and we get snow before we move them, it's twice the work in worse conditions." "I know this land," he said. "There's more grazing left down here than you're reading." "I'm not blind." "I didn't say you were blind. I said you're misreading what you're seeing." She turned to look at him. "I've been watching those cattle every morning for 6 weeks, and I've been watching them for 6 years." They stood there looking at each other, and the silence had an edge to it that hadn't been there before. He'd gotten used to the easy evenings, the working rhythm they'd settled into, and this friction was a reminder that they were still, fundamentally, two people who didn't know each other all that well, making decisions together that affected both of them. "You're the one who owns the land," she said finally. Her voice had dropped the heat out of it, not because she'd backed down, but because she was being deliberate. "It's your call." "I'm not saying that to—" "I know what you're saying. I'm saying I disagree with it." She picked up the fence tool she'd set down. "But you decide." He left the cattle where they were. 4 days later, a cold snap came through and he spent a brutal morning moving the herd in 6 inches of frozen ground. The work was hard and slow, and the cattle were ornery about it, and the whole time Evelyn was right there with him, doing her share without a word about having said what she'd said. Not martyred about it, not pointedly silent, just working. That evening, when they came in exhausted and cold to the bone, he said, "You were right about the cattle." She looked up from pulling off her boot. "I know." "You could say I told you so. What would be the point?" He thought about that. "Most people would? I'm not interested in being right more than I'm interested in getting things done." She set the boot down. "Next time I'll say it louder, though." He almost smiled. "Fair enough. It wasn't the last disagreement, but it established something. That they could disagree and both come through the other side of it intact. That neither of them was going to shatter or blow up or go cold and silent for days. Rowan had known people who operated that way, and it cost a terrible amount of energy. Whatever Evelyn was, she wasn't that. December arrived, and with it the kind of cold that turned breath to vapor and made the morning chores a study in willpower. Rowan split firewood every day now, great stacks of it lined against the south wall of the house where they could reach it from the covered porch without going out into whatever the sky was doing. Evelyn took over the full management of the root cellar, inventorying, rotating, checking for soft spots in the stored vegetables. She'd done more than he'd expected in the fall, and because of it, they were going into winter better stocked than he'd been in years. The days were short, dark by 4:30, which meant the evenings were long, which meant the business of sharing space became more concentrated, more particular. He noticed things he hadn't let himself notice before, or hadn't admitted noticing. The way she laughed at something in one of her books, and then looked up, remembered he was there, and read the passage aloud, as if sharing it was an afterthought when he suspected it wasn't. The way she talked to the horses, not in the high, silly voice some people used, but in a low, direct tone, like she was having a real conversation and expected them to hold up their end. The way she was learning the land, the specific topography of this specific place, the way you could only learn something by walking it over and over in different light and different weather until it got inside you. She was getting inside this place. He could see it happening. What he couldn't see, or wouldn't look at directly, was what that meant for him. He went to town alone one Wednesday for a load of lumber he needed for the barn repairs. The trip was 6 miles each way and took most of the day, and when he came into the general store, Hank Delaney was there buying tobacco, and Hank had a particular kind of smile that meant he was about to say something he'd been saving up. "How's married life treating you, Mercer?" "We're not married," Rowan said. "Common law, then." Hank's smile got bigger. "She seems to be sticking. She's working the ranch. That's more than most men can say about their wives." Hank laughed at his own joke. "Seriously, though, she all right? Town was taking bets she'd be gone by November." Rowan put his order on the counter. "She's all right. Better than all right, from what I hear. Ruth Henderson said she helped pull a calf at the Mastersons' place last week. Middle of a cold snap. Jim Masterson was laid up with his back and his wife couldn't manage it alone, and you're—" Hank paused. "Evelyn went over and helped." Rowan hadn't known about that. "She didn't tell me that," he said. "Sounds about right." Hank tucked his tobacco away. "Anyway, I'm just saying, town's coming around. Takes time, but they're coming around." Rowan loaded the lumber and drove home, and the whole 6 miles he was thinking about what Hank had said. Not the town coming around part. He'd always known that would happen eventually if she stayed and worked, because the frontier didn't care about your opinion of a person as long as the person pulled their weight. What he was thinking about was the Mastersons, about Evelyn driving 3 miles in a cold snap to help a family she barely knew, and then coming home and not mentioning it. He thought about the kind of person that took. When he got back and was unloading the lumber, she came out of the barn to help without being asked, and after they had the wood stacked, he said, "Heard you went to the Mastersons last week." She straightened up. "Jim couldn't work. They needed help." "That's a cold ride in bad weather." "It was fine." She brushed sawdust off her sleeve. "The calf made it." He looked at her for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It wasn't anything," she said. "It wasn't nothing either." She shrugged, the small, uncomfortable shrug of someone who didn't know what to do with being noted. "I didn't want you to think I was over there building goodwill, like a strategy." "I don't think that." "I know you don't." She picked up one of the smaller boards he'd set aside and turned it over in her hands, examining the grain. "I just didn't want to make a thing of it." He went back to stacking the lumber and let it sit, but he carried it with him into the evening. The thing about Evelyn Cross, Rowan was slowly understanding, was that she had been taught, by circumstances and by Donald Cross and by whatever else had happened in those years in Cincinnati, that drawing attention to yourself was dangerous, that being noticed led to being judged. So she did things and didn't mention them, fixed things and walked away, helped people and declined to make it part of her own story. It was a useful quality on a frontier ranch. It was also a kind of scar. He understood scars. Mid-December brought the first real snow. It came in overnight, quiet and thorough, and by morning the world was buried under 14 inches, with more still falling. The mountains had disappeared entirely behind a white wall of sky. The wind was running hard from the northwest, not howling yet, but getting there. Rowan was up at 5. Evelyn was up at 5:15. They worked through the morning in the worst of it, fighting the snow to get to the barn, to the cattle, to the chicken coop, to every living thing on the property that needed tending. The work was twice as hard and took 3 times as long, and the cold had real bite, the kind that got into your wrists even through good gloves and reminded you that the land could kill you if you gave it the chance. By midday, they'd gotten through what needed doing. They came in and Evelyn's coat was stiff with snow and her face was raw and red across the cheekbones. He was not in better shape. They stood in the kitchen dripping and not talking for a minute while the warmth of the house started the slow work of thawing them out. "Coffee?" she said finally. "Yeah," he said. They sat at the table with their hands wrapped around their cups, and for a while there was nothing but the sound of wind against the walls and the occasional shift of the fire. Their coats were hung at the door. Their boots were steaming slightly near the hearth. "Is it always like this?" she asked. "Some years worse," he said. She considered that. "How did you do it alone?" "Slower." He looked at his coffee. "And I lost more. Livestock, mostly. One year I lost half the chickens to cold before I got the coop properly winterized. Lost a heifer to exposure the same winter." He paused. "You get through it, and you do better the next year." "That's a hard way to learn." "It's the only way there is out here." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't want to do this forever." He looked up. I don't mean I want to leave," she said, catching what might have passed across his face. "I mean, I don't want it to always be this hard. The ranch has real potential. The land is good. The location is good. With the right investment and a couple of better seasons, it could be significantly better than it is." She wrapped both hands tighter around her cup. "I've been thinking about it." "Tell me." So she did. She'd been working it through, apparently, for weeks, in that methodical way of hers, the way she approached everything that was a problem to be solved. She talked about expanding the cattle herd, about which section of the north pasture was best suited for extended grazing, about the timing of calving season and how it could be adjusted to reduce the number of difficult births in the worst cold. She talked about the root cellar expansion, about fruit trees, about the creek water rights and whether they were properly documented. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The water rights aren't fully documented." "I know, that's a problem. It's been a problem for a while, the Tillman family on the western edge. They've been pushing at the boundary for 2 years. He set down his cup. "Nothing I could prove was happening. Just cattle showing up in the wrong place, fences moved that I know I set right." Evelyn frowned. "Bill Tillman?" "His father, originally. Bill's running it now. He's not the same kind of man his father was." "What does that mean?" Rowan was quiet for a moment, sorting through how much to say. "His father and I had differences, but we both understood what a line was. Bill is more ambitious. I don't think he cares as much about where lines are." "Have you talked to him?" "Once. He was pleasant about it. That made me more concerned, not less." She looked at him steadily. "You think he's going to make a move on your water?" "I think," Rowan said carefully, "that when 2 bad drought summers in a row happened, Bill Tillman got real interested in how much water access he had. And I think he's been quiet about it for a reason." The snow pressed against the windows. Wind found the eaves and ran along them with a low, singing moan. "You should go to the land office," Evelyn said. "Get everything filed and dated and documented, before he does." "I know I should." "So, I know," he said again. "I'll do it." She looked at him with that particular expression she had, which was not quite skepticism and not quite patience, but something balanced between them that managed to communicate she'd heard that before without actually saying so. "Before the new year," he said. Something in her face eased slightly. "Good." He went to the land office on December 28th, driving through a cold that made the wagon axles creak and groan on every rut. The county land office was in Millhaven, run by a man named Abernethy, who was meticulous and slow and thorough, which were all the qualities you wanted in someone holding documentation that could decide whether your property was yours. Rowan went through his existing paperwork with Abernethy for 2 hours and came away with the water rights situation clarified, dated, and properly registered. As he was leaving, Abernethy said, without looking up from his ledger, "You're the 3rd person this month asking after water documentation on the western edge of that area." Rowan stopped. "Who else?" Abernethy looked up. "Can't say. Confidential." He paused. "But I'll tell you this much. It pays to have your paperwork solid. Some folks come in here thinking they can file something and push a neighbor out later. Doesn't always work that way." He looked back down. "When things are documented right, I mean." Rowan thanked him and left. He drove home in the cold and thought about Bill Tillman and about the quiet way certain men moved before they moved, and about the fact that Evelyn had been the one to push him to go do what he'd been putting off for months. He told her when he got back. She was at the kitchen table going through the account ledger. She'd taken that over sometime in November when she noticed he was making arithmetic errors from fatigue, and she listened to what Abernethy had said without comment until he finished. "He's already been in," she said. "Almost certainly." But your documentation is solid now. Should be. She turned back to the ledger. Good. Then we're ahead of it. He took off his coat and boots and hung them at the door and came to look over her shoulder at the accounts. She'd organized them in a way that was different from his system. Clearer, he admitted to himself, the columns laid out so the pattern of the year was visible rather than just the individual numbers. You changed the format, he said. Your way made it hard to see the whole year at once. I can change it back. No, he said. It's better. She tilted her head slightly and kept writing. New Year came in cold and dark, the last day of 1882 going out with a sky full of clouds that promised more snow. Rowan didn't have the habit of marking the year's turning. It had never seemed to land on anything real, just an arbitrary point in the calendar's rotation. But he found himself that night aware of it. A year ago he'd been alone. 400 acres and a house with a sagging porch, and an account ledger that made him tired to look at, and winters that lasted too long, and evenings that stretched out in the particular loneliness of a man who was functioning but not living. He didn't know what this was yet, what they were. They weren't married. They hadn't spoken of it. There was a careful distance still maintained, 2 separate rooms, a respectful silence around certain things, and he didn't know how long that distance would hold or whether it should. He wasn't sure he was capable of closing it. He wasn't sure he had the right. But the house had a light in it now, and that was different. And the account ledger was organized, and the water rights were documented, and the chicken coop roof didn't leak. And there was a woman asleep in the next room who had helped pull a neighbor's calf in a cold snap and not mentioned it. And the list in his head was getting shorter instead of longer. He sat by the fire a long time that night before he went to bed. January came in with a blizzard that lasted 3 days. It was the kind of storm that silenced everything, that reduced the world to the 10 feet you could see from the window and the animal sounds from the barn that told you things were still alive out there. They burned through firewood fast, and Rowan had to fight through chest-high drifts to get more from the stack, coming back into the house with ice in his eyebrows and the cold set so deep in his hands that the first minutes near the fire felt like something cutting rather than warming. Evelyn had pulled the extra blankets from the chest and draped them over the windows to slow the heat loss. She'd moved the perishable food stores into the kitchen from the back room that had gone too cold. She was thinking ahead, constantly, small practical adjustments that added up. On the second day of the blizzard, a sound from the barn told him one of the horses was in distress. They went out together, fighting the wind, the snow a wall of white noise that made it impossible to hear each other speak. In the barn, the younger mare, the gray, was standing with her head low and her breathing off, favoring her left foreleg. Rowan got down in the straw to look at it and found what he suspected, a cut, probably from the metal edge of the stall partition, that had gotten infected. Not dangerous yet, but headed there if the cold had been slowing circulation. He looked up at Evelyn, who was holding the mare's head, talking to her in that low, quiet way. I need to drain it and get a wrap on it, he said. I need another hand. Tell me what to do. He did. She did it. The mare was not cooperative. She was hurting and she was scared, and she kept moving at the worst moments. And at one point she came close to putting a hoof into Rowan's knee, and Evelyn said sharply, Hey, enough! In a tone that somehow got through to the animal in a way that surprised both of them. The mare steadied. They finished the job. Afterward, they stood in the barn in the lantern light, breathing hard, the wind screaming outside. She'll be all right, Evelyn said. Yeah. He looked at the mare, who was already calming. Good eye on the tone. She was about to get worse before you cut through. I didn't think, She stopped. It seemed like she needed someone to be calm. He looked at her then, fully, in the way he'd been careful not to. Her hair had come loose completely from its pins in the struggle, and there was horse sweat on her sleeve and straw in her coat, and she was looking at the mare with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd done the thing that needed doing. Something moved in him that he didn't try to name. He looked away. Come on, he said. Let's get inside. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 3rd day. They came out into a world buried in white and absolutely still, the sky washed to a pale, brilliant blue. Everything that had been torn at and howled through for 3 days was now motionless and silent and almost beautiful, in the way that things were sometimes beautiful immediately after they tried to kill you. Evelyn stood on the porch, looking at it. He stood beside her. We made it through, she said. We did. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a tone that was a matter of fact but not casual, "I'm glad I came." He didn't answer right away. The cold was clean and sharp in his lungs, and the mountains to the west had emerged from the storm enormous and white and indifferent. "So am I," he said. It wasn't the kind of thing he said. She knew that. He could tell by the slight stillness that ran through her. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition that something had shifted. Neither of them did anything with it. They stepped off the porch into the snow to start digging out. But the words were out there now, in the cold January air, and they didn't disappear. They had 4 months of winter still ahead of them. The Tillman situation was not resolved, just delayed. The ranch was better than it had been, but still a long way from what it could be. There were arguments ahead and hard decisions, and mornings when the work would feel like too much and the cold would feel like it would never end. All of that was true. Rowan knew it. He had no illusions about any of it. But when he looked back at the house from the edge of the yard, the repaired porch, the stacked firewood, the smoke rising from the chimney into the blue winter air, he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. That would take more time, and he knew it. Something more like the beginning of not being braced anymore. The digging out took the better part of 2 days. 14 inches from the first storm, then the blizzard on top of it, meant that the ranch had disappeared under something close to 3 feet of packed and drifted snow in places. The path to the barn was the first priority, then the corral fence, then the road out to the main track, because being cut off was manageable for a day or two, but after that it became dangerous. And Rowan had been cut off long enough in bad winters to know exactly how fast manageable became something else. They worked side by side with shovels and didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. The work was the conversation. By the second afternoon, they had the road passable and the animals tended and a reasonable path between all the structures. Evelyn's hands were bad again. The cold and the shovel handles had opened up a crack on her right palm that kept bleeding through the cloth she'd wrapped around it. And when he noticed it that evening, he didn't say anything, just put the salve tin on the table beside her and went back to his chair. She looked at it and then at him and then used it without comment. That was how things were between them now. A language made mostly of small gestures and the absence of unnecessary words. February was the month everything quietly shifted. It didn't happen in one moment. There was no single conversation, no declaration, nothing that Rowan could have pointed to later and said, "There." That was when it changed. It was more like the way the light changed in February, gradually, almost imperceptibly, a few more minutes each day until suddenly you noticed the afternoons weren't disappearing at 4 o'clock anymore, and you couldn't remember exactly when that had happened. They started sitting closer to each other in the evenings. Not touching, not even particularly close by any objective measure, but closer than the careful opposite ends of the table distance of October. He found himself telling her things. Small things, ranch history, the story of how he'd acquired the bay horse, why the north pasture had that strange low patch that never fully drained, and realized he was doing it not because she needed to know, but because he wanted to tell her. Because she listened in a way that made talking feel worthwhile. She told him things too, about Cincinnati, about her father's hardware store before it failed, about the 2 years she'd spent in service to a family on the east side before she married Donald Cross, and how that had been its own kind of lonely. She didn't tell these stories dramatically. She told them the way you told things to someone you had stopped performing for. He didn't examine any of it too closely. He was afraid that if he examined it, he'd find something that scared him back into the careful distance, and he didn't want to go back there. So he let the evenings be what they were and tried not to think too hard about it. The thing that broke that open was the box. It was a Tuesday in the 3rd week of February, and Evelyn had been reorganizing the back room, a project she'd taken on after the blizzard, when the disarray of everything that had been shoved in there over years finally crossed the line into an actual problem. He was out repairing a section of the corral fence when he heard her go quiet inside. The kind of quiet that you could hear somehow when you were used to the sounds a house made. He kept working for a few minutes. Then he went in. She was standing near the back wall with a wooden box open in her hands. He didn't need to see what was in it. He knew what was in it. He'd put it there himself 2 years after they died. He hadn't been able to keep it in the bedroom where it had lived, where Sarah had kept it, on the shelf by the window. But he also hadn't been able to throw it out or give it away. So he'd put it in the back room and covered it with other things, and not opened it since. Evelyn looked up when she heard him. Her face was careful. Not guilty, not sentimental, just careful. I wasn't, she started. It's all right. I didn't know what it was. I should have left it. It's all right, he said again. She set it on the shelf beside her and stepped back from it, and he crossed the room and looked down at what was inside. Sarah's few pieces of jewelry, a bracelet, 2 rings, a small locket, the photograph of her family that had lived on her bedside table, Thomas's first boot, just one, the left one, which he'd had on the afternoon Rowan last carried him, a scrap of muslin that had been a piece of his blanket. Rowan looked at it for a long time. He was 2, he said, when he died. Thomas. He hadn't said the name out loud to anyone since the funeral. His throat did something when he said it that he couldn't fully control. He was just starting to talk. He had maybe 20 words. He called the horses big dogs because I couldn't get him to understand the difference. Something came and went in his chest. I kept waiting for him to add more words. I had this whole idea of... He stopped. It doesn't matter now. It matters, Evelyn said quietly. He picked up the small boot. It fit in his palm. He'd forgotten how small it was. Sarah was sick first, he said. She got it 3 days before he did. And I thought she was the one I was going to lose. I sat with her every night for 2 days, and I talked to her, and I held her hand, and I was so fixed on her that I didn't... His voice went rough, and he let it be rough, because there was no point now in making it smooth. I didn't see how fast Thomas was going. By the time I understood, it was too late for him. He was gone in a day. He set the boot back in the box. And then Sarah, another 4 days after. The room was absolutely still. I've been thinking, he said, for 4 years, that I missed it. That if I hadn't been so focused on her, I would have seen him sooner, and maybe... He stopped again. There's no end to that sentence that makes any sense. The fever killed a dozen people that winter, but I've been carrying the if around like there was something I could have done and didn't. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was low but steady. You were a father trying to save his wife while his child was dying. Both things were happening at once. There was no right place to look. I know that. Do you? He looked at her. Her eyes were direct and serious, and there was nothing soft or consoling in them. No performance of comfort. She was just telling him what she believed to be true. I know it in my head, he said. The rest of me is still... He made a gesture that didn't quite mean anything, but that she seemed to understand. The rest of you has been alone with it for 4 years, she said. That's a long time to be alone with something. He closed the box. His hands were not entirely steady. I'm going to put this in the bedroom, he said. On the shelf. He picked it up. It shouldn't have been in here. She nodded once and said nothing else, and he carried the box through the house and set it on the bedroom shelf where it had always belonged, where the light came through the window in the morning the way Sarah had liked. He stood there for a minute with his hand on it. Then he went back out and finished the corral fence. That evening, neither of them referred to what had happened. But the dinner was quieter, and the quiet was different from the usual comfortable silence. It was the quiet of 2 people who had crossed into territory they hadn't been in before and were still finding their footing. Rowan ate and looked at his plate and thought about the fact that he had not said Thomas's name out loud in 4 years, and now he had said it in that back room to a woman he'd known for 4 months, and something about it had loosened in him in a way that was painful and also, distantly, a relief. He thought about what she'd said. That's a long time to be alone with something. She knew about that particular kind of alone. He'd understood that since November. They were, in that specific way, people who had learned the same lesson by different roads. After supper, she put on her coat and went out for the last check of the night, the way she always did. He watched her through the window for a moment, the lantern swinging at her side, her breath visible in the cold air, her unhurried walk across the snow-packed yard. He was in love with her. He didn't let himself sit with that for long. He turned away from the window and washed the supper dishes and went to bed. And he lay in the dark for a long time not sleeping, and he was afraid of it. Afraid the way you were afraid of something that could cost you everything, because he knew exactly what everything looked like when it was gone. March came in, and with March came Bill Tillman. He didn't come to this ranch himself. That wasn't Bill Tillman's way. Instead, a man named Pruitt showed up at the door one gray Thursday morning, a hired hand from the look of him, with a folded paper in a manner that was polite in the particular way of men who had been told to be polite. Rowan took the paper and read it on the porch, while Pruitt waited with his hands in his pockets. It was a formal notice. Bill Tillman was claiming that the water access on the Western Creek boundary had been jointly understood since the original Mercer land acquisition, and that recent weather conditions requiring expanded grazing had necessitated clarification of that understanding. He was requesting a formal review of the boundary documentation at the county land office. "What does he think a review is going to find?" Evelyn said, reading it over his shoulder. She'd come to the door when she heard the knock. "He thinks his paperwork is going to look older than mine," Rowan said. He folded the notice. "Which it might." "But you filed in December. Abernethy dated it." "Abernethy dated my filing. The question is going to be what the original grant documentation says." He looked at Pruitt. "Tell Tillman I'll be at the land office on Monday." Pruitt nodded and left without another word. Rowan stood on the porch after he'd gone, looking out at the western fence line, which was visible from there, a thin, dark line against the white of the remaining snow, beyond which was Tillman land and the creek in question. "How bad is this?" Evelyn asked. "It's bad," he said. "The creek feeds the north pasture. If he gets any claim on it, I lose my best summer grazing." He was quiet a moment. "The original grant, my father's original grant, before I inherited it, the language was apparently not airtight. I found that out in December from Abernethy. The water rights were implied, not explicit." "Why didn't you say that in December?" He looked at her. "Because I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." She didn't point out the obvious problem with that approach. "What do we have?" she said instead. "My December filing. 4 years of tax payments showing the full land use, including water, and—" He paused. "My father's correspondence with the original surveyor, if I can find it." "Where is it?" "In the trunk in the back room. Possibly. I haven't gone through that trunk in years." She was already going back inside. They spent the entire afternoon going through the trunk, which was less a trunk and more a compressed record of 30 years of Mercer family documentation. Deeds, receipts, personal letters, surveys, tax records, and a great deal of paper that had no relevance to anything except as evidence that his father had never thrown anything away. Evelyn organized as they went, sorting into piles with the focused efficiency she brought to everything, and Rowan went through each pile while she worked the next. He found the surveyor's correspondence near the bottom, wedged between 2 land grant copies and a water-stained letter from his father's brother. There were 3 letters from a man named Gerald Hatch, surveyor, written between 1861 and 1863. The 3rd letter was the one that mattered. In it, Hatch explicitly stated that the Western Creek boundary had been included in the Mercer parcel survey with full water rights, and referenced the specific coordinates of the boundary stones he'd placed. Rowan read it twice. Then he handed it to Evelyn. She read it and said, "Does Abernethy know about these letters?" "No." "Then Abernethy needs to know about them on Monday, before Tillman gets there." He drove to Millhaven on Saturday, not waiting for Monday, and spent an hour with Abernethy going through all 3 letters. Abernethy read them carefully with the expression of a man who was having a good day professionally. "These predate Tillman's family's acquisition by 8 years, Abernethy said, "and they reference boundary stones. If those stones are still in place—" "One of them is," Rowan said. "I know exactly where it is. I've passed it my whole life." Abernethy made copies of the letters, dated and witnessed them, and added them to Rowan's file. "Monday's review," he said, looking over his spectacles, "is going to go a particular way." Rowan came home and told Evelyn. She was at the kitchen table with the ranch account spread in front of her, and she listened to all of it and then sat back and let out a slow breath. "Good," she said. "That's good." "It's not over," he said. "Tillman can challenge the letters, claim their original correspondence between your father and a licensed surveyor," she said. "He can challenge anything he wants. It's going to cost him more than it costs you." She looked at him levelly. "Is he the kind of man who keeps spending when the math stops working in his favor?" Rowan considered that. "No," he said. "He's ambitious, not stupid." "Then Monday is going to be the end of it." It wasn't quite the end of it, but it was close enough. Monday's meeting at the land office included Tillman himself, his hired lawyer from Helena, and Rowan. Abernethy laid out the documentation in the order it had been filed. Tillman's lawyer raised 3 objections, each of which Abernethy addressed from the file with the calm of a man who'd been doing this for 20 years. When the surveyor's letters were presented, the lawyer asked to examine them, and spent a long time doing so, and then leaned over and said something quiet to Tillman. Tillman looked at Rowan across the table with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral. "Is there anything you'd like to add, Mr. Tillman?" Abernethy said. "We'll take the documentation under advisement," the lawyer said. "That's your right," Abernethy said. "But the county's position is that the documentation is complete and the water rights are vested in the Mercer parcel. Any challenge would need to be filed through the district court." He paused. "In Helena." Helena was 2 days away. Tillman stood up and put on his hat. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Rowan, and there was something in his face that was not friendliness and was not quite a threat, but was in the range between them. "Your father was a stubborn man," he said. "Yes," Rowan said. "He was." Tillman left. Abernethy gathered his papers. "I don't think you'll hear from him again," he said. "Men like that move on to softer targets." Rowan drove home with the late March light going golden across the snow, which was finally starting to thin at the edges. The mountains were still white above the tree line, but the valley floor had bare patches now. Gray-brown grass, muddy ground, the first suggestion of the season turning. When he got back, Evelyn was outside with the chickens. She looked up when the wagon came through the gate, and she didn't ask, just read his face. "Good," she said, the same word she'd said on Saturday. Just the one word, and then back to the chickens. He unhitched the horse and went in and put the kettle on. He stood in the kitchen by the window, looking out at the yard, at the woman in the yard, and at the mountains beyond the yard. And the feeling that had been growing in him since February was quieter now, but more solid, less frightening, more like something that was just true. He'd been afraid of it because he'd learned in the worst possible way that loving people meant that losing them was possible, and losing them was the kind of pain he had spent 4 years building a life specifically to avoid. He understood that about himself with complete clarity. He'd taken a loss that would have been devastating for anyone, and he'd used it to wall himself off. And he told himself it was grief, but it was also, if he was honest, fear wearing grief's clothes. Evelyn had not asked him to take that wall down. She'd never pushed. She'd just lived alongside him and worked alongside him and been honest with him in the way that people were honest with each other when they'd stopped worrying about what the other person would think. And somewhere in that, the wall had started to matter less. Not because it had been dismantled, but because he'd stopped standing behind it. He heard her boots on the porch, and then she came inside, and he turned from the window. She looked at him. He was usually harder to read than this, he knew. He kept a flat face well. It was one of the things Clara had always complained about. But whatever she saw in him now made her go still in the doorway. "Rowan," she said, not a question. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. Her hand was still on the door handle. "I've been thinking about what happens when spring comes and the ranch work picks up and we have to—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't want you to think that you're here out of obligation, or that I'm maintaining something because I don't know how to change it." He looked at the kettle because it was easier. "I know when you came here it was under the understanding that this was a working arrangement, that neither of us wanted—" He stopped again. He was not good at this. He'd known he wasn't good at this, but he hadn't appreciated how bad at it he actually was until this moment. "I'm saying it wrong," he said. "You're doing fine," she said, and there was something careful in her voice that told him she was braced for either thing this could be. He made himself look at her. "I don't want it to be a working arrangement anymore," he said. "I want you here because you want to be here. Not because you have nowhere else to go and I have fences that need mending." He held her gaze. "I want you here because I want you here." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something optimistic in the direction of the barn. Evelyn let go of the door handle. "That's different from what you said at the station," she said. "In October." "Yes." "You were very clear at the station." "I know what I said at the station." She crossed her arms, not in hostility, but in the way she did when she was thinking something through carefully. "I need to ask you something." "All right." "Is this because of the Tillman situation resolving? Because you're feeling—" "No," he said, flatly and immediately, and she could hear that it was true. No, the Tillman situation was yesterday. This has been... He stopped, tried again. This has been February, probably earlier. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look and didn't qualify it. I'm not going to be easy to live with, she said. I have opinions. I will tell you when I think you're wrong. I will not simply agree with you to keep the peace. I know that. I'm not... She paused and something briefly difficult moved through her face. I am not what a man out here pictures when he pictures a wife. I know what I look like. I know what Eleanor Haskins thinks. I know... Stop, he said. She stopped. I know what you look like, he said. I know exactly what you look like. I am standing in my own kitchen telling you that I want you here because I want you, and you standing there reciting Eleanor Haskins' opinions is... He felt something flare in him that was a kind of controlled anger, not at her, but at every version of the voice she'd internalized. It's not a conversation I'm willing to have. She was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression had shifted. Not fully open, she didn't go fully open, but less braced. I'm not used to this, she said. Neither am I. I'm not used to being... She stopped and looked at the floor briefly, the small tell she had when she was working to keep her voice even. Donald spent 4 years telling me what I wasn't, what I didn't have to offer, and I knew he was wrong, but you hear something enough. She stopped. I know, he said. You can't just fix that. I know you can't just fix it, so don't expect... I'm not expecting anything, he said. I'm telling you the truth about what I want, that's all. You do what you want with it. She stood there looking at him, and he stood there looking at her, and the kettle on the stove behind him started to whisper, not quite boiling yet, but getting there. Finally, she said, I want to stay. It was simple and direct, and that was how she said everything that mattered, and he felt it in his chest the way you felt things that were real. All right, he said. She unfolded her arms. The kettle came to a full boil, and he turned to get it, and when he turned back, she was at the table, pulling her coat off, settling in the way she settled when she was home. And that was it. That was the whole thing, really, because there was no dramatic gesture and no sweeping anything, just a woman pulling her coat off at the kitchen table and a man making 2 cups of tea. But the room was different. He could feel it. Even the corners of it felt different. He set her cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. Outside the window, the muddy edges of the yard were evidence that the worst of the winter was breaking. There were things to do. There were always things to do. The list never got short enough to be comfortable. But the late afternoon light was the light of a season turning, and the ranch was still standing, and the water rights were secured, and the woman across the table had said, I want to stay. Spring's coming early, she said, looking out the window. Maybe, he said. Don't count on it. March lies. I've noticed. She sipped her tea. The north pasture is going to be muddy until May. Yeah. We should look at the east drainage situation before the snow melt. I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something that was not quite a smile moved between them. The private, understated kind. The kind that didn't need to announce itself. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. It wasn't a beginning so much as a recognition of something that had already been there. Growing under the surface of every day they'd worked together and argued and eaten supper across from each other and been honest in the small, ordinary, irreplaceable ways that mattered more than any grand thing. What they'd built in that cold, difficult winter wasn't a romance by any picture book understanding. It was something harder and more real than that. 2 people who'd been broken in different ways, discovering that the breaks didn't have to mean the end of holding something together. The fire in the hearth settled. The light outside went amber, then rose. The last of the late March sunset spreading across the white and dirty brown landscape of a winter finally giving ground. Inside, 2 cups of tea grew cold while 2 people sat and talked about drainage and spring planting and the east pasture fence, and neither of them was alone anymore. And neither of them said so, because they both already knew. March did lie, exactly as Rowan said it would. The brief warmth that had started melting the yard and softening the ground pulled back in the last week of the month like something that had never meant it, and 2 more inches of wet, heavy snow came down and made the muddy places worse than they'd been before. The east drainage problem Evelyn had flagged became an urgent one when the snowmelt started running the wrong direction and pooling against the barn's foundation. They spent a full day digging a trench by hand in ground that was half frozen and half soup, and it was miserable work. The kind where nothing went cleanly, and by noon they were both covered in mud to the knee and not speaking much. Rowan hit a buried rock with his spade, and the impact rattled up his arms, and he said something under his breath that he didn't normally say in front of her. Agreed, she said, without looking up from her own digging. He looked at her, mud on her cheek, hair stuck to her forehead, a line of grim concentration between her brows, and something in him that had been tightly wound all morning just let go. We're going to have to go around it, he said. I know. I've been thinking that for the last hour. You could have said so. You looked like you needed to hit something. He put the spade down. Fair enough. They went around the rock. The trench took another 2 hours, but it worked, and the water started moving in the right direction. And by evening, the pooling at the barn foundation had drained enough to satisfy them both. They stood looking at the result in the gray late afternoon light. Two people too tired to feel proud, but too practical not to note that the thing was done. Supper? She said. Yeah, he said. That was how April started, in mud and cold and the grinding, unromantic work of keeping a ranch alive through the worst of the season change. But there was something different about it now. Some quality to the shared exhaustion that was not the same as the parallel exhaustion of two people working the same land out of necessity. It was harder to name than that. It was the difference between bearing weight and choosing to carry it together, which sounds like a small distinction until you've experienced both. He noticed it in the mornings especially. She was still up before him sometimes, but now she waited, made 2 cups instead of 1, and when he came in from the first check of the barn, she handed his across without ceremony. And they stood at the kitchen window and drank them and looked at whatever the morning was doing, and that 10 minutes was something he had started quietly to depend on. He didn't say that. He was still not good at saying things. But she seemed to know it anyway, because she didn't move through those mornings quickly. She let them be what they were. Clara arrived on the 14th of April. Rowan had not told her what had happened between them, partly because there wasn't a clean way to explain it in a telegram, and partly because Clara would have had opinions that he was not ready to manage. So when her wagon came through the gate on a Tuesday morning, he was in the barn and Evelyn was in the garden, and they had about 45 seconds of warning before his sister was in the yard. Clara Mercer, Clara Fowler, now, for the past 12 years, was a compact woman with their father's jaw and the particular energy of someone who had decided at age 8 that the world ran better when she was involved in it. She was not a malicious person. She was simply congenitally unable to leave things alone. Rowan loved her and found her exhausting in roughly equal measure. She stepped out of the wagon and looked at the yard, the repaired porch, the organized woodpile, the visible order of a place that was being genuinely maintained. And then she looked at Evelyn, who had come around from the garden with dirt on her gloves and her hair coming loose the way it always did by mid-morning. "You're Evelyn," Clara said. "I am," Evelyn said. "You're Clara." "Yes." Clara looked at her with the undisguised assessment of a woman who had arranged this match and was now examining the results. "How is he treating you?" "Clara," Rowan started. "I'm asking her." Evelyn pulled off one of her gardening gloves and tucked it in her apron pocket. "He's treating me well," she said. "We work hard and we respect each other and we're getting through the winter." "Getting through the winter," Clara repeated, with a tone that suggested this was insufficient. "It's April," Evelyn said pleasantly. "The winter isn't entirely over." Clara looked at her for another moment, and then something in her face shifted. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. She'd been expecting something, and she wasn't getting it, and she was deciding what she thought about that. "You're not what I pictured," she said. "No," Evelyn said. "I expect not." She gestured toward the house. "Come in. I'll put coffee on." Clara watched her go inside and then looked at Rowan. "She's not what I pictured at all," she said again, this time with different weight. "What did you picture?" he said. "Someone meek," Clara said it matter-of-factly. "I thought you needed someone meek because I thought you'd run off anyone with opinions. I was trying to get someone past your defenses." She paused. "I think I may have miscalculated in the right direction. You could have told me what you were doing. You would have said no." "I did say no. I sent you a telegram. And then you drove to the station anyway." She picked up her bag from the wagon. "So?" He didn't have anything to say to that. He took her bag and followed her inside. The 3 days of Clara's visit were instructive in the way that visitors were always instructive. They showed you how things looked from the outside, which was sometimes very different from how they felt from the inside. Clara watched him and Evelyn with the intent but not quite obvious attention of a woman cataloging information. And on the second evening, when Evelyn had gone out for the last barn check of the night, Clara sat across from Rowan at the kitchen table and folded her hands and looked at him. "She's in love with you," Clara said. Rowan looked at his coffee. "Don't do that," Clara said. "Don't look at your cup. I'm talking to you." "I know what you're doing." "Good. Then we can skip the part where I have to work around your stubbornness." She leaned forward. "Are you in love with her?" He was quiet. "Rowan." "Yes," he said, flat and simple, the way he'd said difficult things his whole life. "Yes." Clara sat back. "Okay," she said. "Okay, good." She was quiet for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, her voice softened. "Sarah would not have wanted this for you. This—" She made a gesture that encompassed the empty half of the table, the single chair that had been empty for years, the whole shape of a life lived minimally. She would have been furious, honestly. "You know how she felt about—" "I know," he said. "Then stop carrying it like you owe her your misery." It landed harder than he'd expected. He sat with it. "I'm not trying to be harsh," Clara said. "I'm trying to say that loving Evelyn doesn't cost Sarah anything. It's not a trade." She looked at him steadily. "You're allowed to be alive, Rowan. That's all I'm saying." When Evelyn came back in, she looked between the two of them and read the room with the accuracy she brought to everything. She didn't ask. She just put the kettle on and sat down and included herself in the conversation they shifted toward, which was spring planting and fence plans and the cattle count, and Clara talked ranch logistics with the engagement of someone who'd grown up on a spread herself, and the evening got easier. The morning Clara left, she hugged Evelyn, briefly, practical, not a woman who lingered in embraces, and said, "Don't let him be impossible." And Evelyn said, "I haven't so far." And Clara got in her wagon and drove away. Rowan watched the wagon disappear around the far bend of the road. Beside him, Evelyn said nothing. He was thinking about what Clara had said the night before, and he suspected Evelyn had something of her own she was thinking about, because she had that particular stillness she got when she was processing something she wasn't ready to say yet. He let it sit. There was plenty of work to occupy them. Spring broke properly in the third week of April, the way spring in Montana eventually broke. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door kicked open. The temperature jumped 15 degrees in 4 days. The remaining snow vanished from everything but the north-facing slopes, and the land came back to life with the urgency of something that had been waiting a long time. The creek ran full and loud with snowmelt. The grass came up green in the lower pastures. The horses got restless and the cattle spread out and needed watching. Rowan had never been good at spring the way some men were. He understood winter. Winter was containable, a matter of endurance and preparation. Spring was chaotic. Everything needed doing at once, and the season was going to run whether you were ready or not. This spring was different. He had a second pair of hands, a second mind working alongside his, and the list he'd been managing alone for years was getting handled at a pace he hadn't experienced in a long time. Evelyn had taken the garden fully in hand and had it planted 2 weeks ahead of when he'd ever gotten it done. She'd organized the calving records in the new system she'd developed over the winter, which meant that when the first heifers started going early, they knew exactly which animals to watch and when. She was out in the field with him for the long days, and she didn't need to be managed or directed. She saw what needed doing and did it, or came to him with a specific question and acted on the answer. One afternoon in early May, they were mending the south fence together, the long stretch of it that ran along the road, which had heaved badly in the freeze-thaw cycle and needed almost 400 yards of attention. And the work was going well, the kind of rhythm you found when you'd worked alongside someone long enough to know each other's pace. He was setting posts, she was stringing wire, and they'd been at it for 3 hours and were maybe 2/3 through. Then she said, not stopping her work, "I've been thinking about what you said in March." He didn't ask which thing. He knew. "I've been thinking about it since March," she said. "I don't say that to make you wait. I say it because I want you to know it wasn't a small thing, and I haven't been treating it like a small thing." He set the next post and tamped it. "All right. I have—" She stopped, pulled the wire taut, and secured it, then moved to the next span. I have spent a long time being afraid of wanting things, because wanting things and then not getting them or having them taken away is a particular kind of pain that I got very tired of. She was not looking at him, her hands working steadily. So I learned to want less, or to pretend I wanted less. I got good at it. I know, he said. I don't want to do that anymore. She did look at him then, over the top of the wire she was working. I want to stop doing that. She steadied herself in the small way she had, a slight squaring of the shoulders. I want this, you, the ranch, all of it. Not because I have nowhere else to go, and not because the alternative is worse, because I want it. He came around the post and stopped in front of her. She held his gaze, which she always did, even when it was hard. He reached out and took her hand, the right one, the one that still had the faint ghost of the crack along the palm from the winter shoveling, and held it in both of his. Marry me, he said. It wasn't a speech. He didn't have a speech in him, and she wouldn't have wanted one. Just those two words, direct and real, the way she said things that mattered, and the way he was learning to. She looked at their hands, then at him. Yes, she said. The fence waited. The afternoon went long around them. The May light coming in at a low, golden angle across the grass, the mountains present and enormous to the west, the ranch spread out in its imperfect, working reality behind them. There was no one to witness it but the horses in the far pasture and the wind moving through the new grass. He didn't let go of her hand right away. She didn't pull it back. They stood there in the middle of the half-mended fence line, like two people who had just said something permanent and were letting it settle into the ground. Then she said, "We should finish this section before we lose the light." "Yeah," he said. They went back to work. They were married on the second Saturday of June in the small valley below the north pasture where the creek ran clear and the grass had come in thick and the mountains made a wall of white and green to the west. There was no minister available on short notice. Millhaven's traveled a circuit, and his next visit wasn't for 3 weeks. So Justice of the Peace Harold Birch drove out from town and read the necessary words from the county records book, which was about as romantic as a land deed but suited them both better than ceremony for ceremony's sake. The witnesses were Hank Delaney and his wife, and Jim and Ruth Henderson, who had driven over together, and old Abernethy from the land office, who had shown up uninvited but brought a very good bottle of whiskey and was therefore welcome. Clara had come from Billings, had cried twice before the ceremony even started, and was vigorously denying both instances. Evelyn wore a dress she'd made herself, a deep blue wool that she'd ordered the fabric for in April and sewn in the evenings. It was not an elaborate dress. It was well made and fit her properly, and she wore it with the same straight, settled posture she brought to everything. She'd put her hair up carefully and managed to keep it there mostly, which was an achievement Rowan privately noted. He stood next to her and listened to Harold Birch read the words, and he said what he was supposed to say when he was supposed to say it. And when he looked at her beside him, he thought about the train platform in October, the worn suitcase, the woman who'd stood in the empty station without collapsing, and he thought about all the mornings since then, all the fence lines and cold mornings and arguments and dinners and evenings by the fire. And he thought, this is what it looks like to choose something. He had not chosen much in the years after Sarah. He'd endured. There was a difference, and he understood it now in a way he hadn't before. "You may," Harold Birch started. Rowan didn't wait for the rest of it. He kissed her, and the small crowd of people in the valley made a sound that was half laughter and half something warmer. And Evelyn's hand came up and gripped the front of his shirt briefly, and then let go, and they separated, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, but that he thought was the closest thing to unguarded he'd ever seen on her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Mercer," he said, because it was barely 10 o'clock. "Good morning," she said. Hank Delaney opened the whiskey at 10 in the morning, and nobody thought less of him for it. The reception, such as it was, lasted 3 hours in the valley and then moved to the ranch kitchen where Ruth Henderson had organized food without telling anyone, and the table was full of things that people had brought. Clara produced a cake that she'd driven from Billings with the single-minded protectiveness of a woman transporting something explosive, and it was very good, and she accepted the compliments on it with a satisfaction that suggested she'd known it would be and had simply been waiting for confirmation. Eleanor Haskins was not there. She had not been invited, and if she'd heard about the wedding through town, which she certainly had, she'd apparently made the calculation that showing up uninvited was a step past what even she could justify. Rowan didn't think about her. He had bigger things to occupy him. At some point in the afternoon, when the kitchen was full of conversation and Evelyn was talking to Ruth Henderson about something that had them both laughing, Clara appeared at Rowan's shoulder with 2 cups of something and handed him one. "She's going to be good for this place," Clara said. "She already has been. I mean long term." Clara watched Evelyn across the room. "She's not going anywhere." "I know." "Do you know, or are you hoping?" He looked at his sister. "I know," he said. Clara nodded once, satisfied in the way she was satisfied when things she'd put in motion arrived at their intended destination. She would never fully stop taking credit for it, he knew. He'd decided he could live with that. The guests left in the late afternoon, the Hendersons first, then Hank and his wife, then Abernethy, who shook Rowan's hand at the door with a grip that suggested he was genuinely pleased about how Monday in the land office had eventually resolved itself. Clara stayed to help clean up, which meant staying another hour and a half and talking through most of it, and when she finally hugged Evelyn goodbye, she held it a little longer than she had in April, and Evelyn let her. Rowan walked his sister out to her wagon. "You're going to stop being impossible now, right?" Clara said, getting up onto the seat. "I was never—" "You were profoundly impossible for 4 years." She gathered the reins. "I'm not criticizing. I'm noting that the phase appears to be over." He held the horse's bridle while she got settled. "Thank you," he said, "for the telegram, for not canceling it." Clara looked at him from the wagon seat for a moment, and the sharpness she usually wore went quiet for just a second. "She needed somewhere to land," she said, "and you needed—" She clicked to the horse. "Well, you needed her." He let go of the bridle and stepped back. She lifted a hand and drove out through the gate. He stood in the yard in the evening light, the June evening light, which lasted until 9 and turned everything the color of warm metal. And he could hear Evelyn inside, the sounds of her moving through the kitchen, putting the last of the clean dishes away, and the sounds of it were the sounds of someone who lived here, fully and without reservation, and the house held them differently than it had. He came back inside. She was at the window over the sink, looking out at the last of the light. She heard him and didn't turn immediately. "Big day," she said. "Yeah." She turned then and leaned back against the counter and looked at him in the direct evaluating way she had, except that this particular look was softer at the edges than her usual ones. Not soft in the sense of uncertain, soft in the sense of choosing to be open. "Are you all right?" she asked. He'd been asked that question at various points over the past 4 years by various people, and it had usually been a question about grief, whether he was managing, whether he was coping, the careful inquiry of people who knew he'd been hurt and were checking whether the hurt was still acute. He knew that wasn't what she was asking. She was asking about today, about the specific weight of today, and the specific geography of what it meant to stand in this kitchen on this evening, having done what they'd done in the valley this morning. "Yes," he said. And then, because she deserved more than that, "It's different than I thought it would feel. Better different. Not—" He looked for the word. "Not the absence of something, more like addition," she said quietly. "Yeah." He looked at her. "Yeah, that." She crossed to him and put her hand against the side of his face, briefly, the kind of touch that wasn't romantic in a theatrical sense, but was intimate in the way that genuine intimacy usually was, quiet and direct, and saying something for which there weren't better words. He put his hand over hers. Outside, the last of the light was going, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky still faintly luminous at the horizon, and the ranch was still and full of the ordinary sounds of evening, the horses settling, the creek audible in the distance, a bird doing something late and unnecessary in the direction of the garden. None of it was perfect. The south fence wasn't done yet. The barn needed a new ridgepole before the next hard winter. The accounts showed 2 tight months ahead before the summer grazing income came in. Rowan's past was still his past, and Evelyn's was still hers, and they were still 2 imperfect people who argued about cattle and had bad days and were occasionally worse at talking than the situation required. But the house had both of them in it now, fully, without reservation, and the list in Rowan's head was shorter than it had been since the day he'd first looked at this land, and understood what it would take to keep it. And the woman who'd stepped off a train in October with a single worn suitcase and nowhere else to go had, somewhere between the frozen fence line and the root cellar and the kitchen table in the valley where the creek ran clear, become the person he came home to. He was not going to waste that. He let go of her hand and said, "I'll do the last barn check." "I'll have supper on when you get back," she said. The same exchange they'd had 100 times that winter, the same ordinary words, and they were the best words he knew. He put on his coat and went out into the evening. The summer after they married was the hardest working season Rowan had put in since the early years, when the ranch had been new and underdeveloped, and every acre of it had been a problem waiting to happen. The difference was that this time the hard work was building towards something, instead of simply holding the line against collapse. They expanded the herd by 12 head in July, purchasing from a rancher 2 valleys over who was scaling down. It was money they didn't entirely have, and the conversation about whether to do it went 3 evenings and involved Evelyn laying out 2 sets of numbers on the table, one showing the cost of the purchase against projected summer grazing income, one showing what the herd looked like at the end of 3 years if they bought now versus waiting. Rowan looked at both sets of numbers and argued against them, and she let him argue, and then showed him the numbers again, and he looked at them a second time and said, "All right," the same way he'd said it about the cattle move in November, which she was kind enough not to reference. The 12 new head required attention through the first month. 3 of them had come from a crowded situation and needed time to settle into the Mercer grazing pattern. One had a disposition problem that required Rowan to spend 2 full mornings working with it before it decided to behave. He came in on the second evening with a bruise developing on his left forearm from where the animal had caught him against a fence post and said, with the flat restraint of a man choosing not to say the full version of what he was thinking, "That one is going to be a problem." "She'll settle," Evelyn said, looking at the bruise. "She was jammed in that pen for 6 months. She doesn't trust the space yet. She's going to have to trust it faster. She will. She brought the salve without being asked. Give her another week." "If she puts me into a fence post again, give her a week," Evelyn said. He gave her the week. The animal settled, more or less. He didn't mention that Evelyn had been right because she already knew, and she didn't mention it because she didn't need to. That was the texture of their first summer. The accumulation of small negotiations, small victories, small failures, all of them building a life that was neither of them's alone anymore. There were days it was easy and days it was not. There were mornings they ate breakfast in silence, not from contentment, but from friction, from some exchange the night before that hadn't fully resolved. And they moved through those mornings with the particular careful attention of 2 people who'd both been hurt before and knew better than to let a small fire go unattended. He was not a naturally expressive man. She was not a naturally trusting woman. These facts did not disappear because they'd said words in a valley with a justice of the peace. What they had was not the absence of difficulty. It was the presence of something strong enough to carry it. Bill Tillman, as Abernethy had predicted, moved on to softer targets. There was a story in August about a dispute with a homesteader to the north. Someone newer to the area, without deep documentation, without a father's surveyor correspondence in a trunk. And the story went the way those stories went when one side had resources and the other didn't. Rowan heard it from Hank Delaney and felt something complicated about it. Relief that it hadn't been him, and a dim anger about what it was instead. "Is there anything to be done?" Evelyn asked when he told her. "For the homesteader?" "Yes." He thought about it. "The county could get involved if someone made a formal complaint, but that takes the homesteader being willing to push it, and most people in that position can't afford the fight. What if we offered to help? Not financially." She was already thinking through it, the way she thought through problems, out loud and moving. What if we went to Abernethy and asked what documentation the homesteader would need? What if Hank Delaney and the Hendersons knew about it? People with standing in the county who could make the case that Tillman is a pattern, not a one-off? He looked at her. "That's a fight that isn't ours." "I know it isn't ours." She looked back at him steadily. "That's not the same as it not being right." He thought about the homesteader, a man named Selby, from what Hank said, with a wife and 2 young children and not much else. He thought about what Abernethy had said the previous December. Men like that move on to softer targets. The softness of a target was often just a function of whether anyone was paying attention. "Let me talk to Hank," he said. It took most of August. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no courtroom speeches, nothing that made a story in the telling. Rowan and Hank Delaney and Jim Henderson went to Abernethy together and laid out what they knew, and Abernethy, who had his own opinions about Bill Tillman and had been forming them for years, advised Selby on the documentation he needed and walked him through the filing process at no charge for his time, because Abernethy was that kind of man when he chose to be. The county land board sent a letter to Tillman's lawyer. Tillman's lawyer sent a letter back. There were 2 more letters after that, and then silence. Selby kept his water. Rowan only heard about the resolution secondhand from Hank on a Tuesday in late August. He came home and told Evelyn, and she nodded once and went back to what she was doing, and that was that. Neither of them made it into a larger story. It was a thing that needed doing, and they'd helped do it, and the satisfaction in it was real but quiet, the way the best satisfactions usually were. The autumn of 1883 came in cleaner than the previous year. Rowan couldn't say exactly why, whether it was the better preparations or the fact that the worst of the startup difficulties were behind them, or simply luck. But the season settled into its work without the edge of desperation that had characterized October through December the year before. They were not comfortable. Frontier ranching in Montana was not a comfortable life and never would be. But they were stable in a way that felt earned rather than borrowed. Evelyn found out she was pregnant in October. She told him on a Wednesday evening after supper, not with preamble, just directly, in the way she said everything that mattered. He sat with it for a moment, the information moving through him in layers, and she watched him with the careful attention of someone reading weather. "Are you—" he started. "I'm well," she said. "Before you ask. I feel fine." He nodded. He was looking at the table, and then he wasn't. He was looking at her fully, and she held the look. He stopped, tried again. "I don't have a word for what I am right now." "That's all right," she said quietly. "I need a minute." "Take it." He got up and went outside. Not away from her. He wasn't running from it. Just outside, into the night air, where the sky was enormous and cold and the mountains were black shapes against it. He stood in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and let the thing wash through him. The fear first, which he'd known would come, because he understood what it meant to love something you could lose, and he had specific, irreversible knowledge of that loss. The fear was real, and he didn't try to talk himself out of it. He let it be what it was. And then the other thing. He didn't have a name for it. It was larger than happiness and more complicated. It was something like the feeling of standing on land you'd thought was gone and finding it solid under your feet. It was the specific disorienting quality of a future that he hadn't let himself believe in for 4 years suddenly being real and present and requiring him to stand up to it. He went back inside. She was still at the table, her hands around her cup, waiting. He sat down across from her. "I'm afraid," he said. "I know. I'm also—" He looked at her and couldn't finish the sentence, and didn't need to, because she could read his face now. She'd learned it over the past year, the way you learned the land detail by detail, and she knew what was in it. "Me too," she said. "Both things." He reached across the table and took her hand. They sat like that for a while without talking, and the fire settled in the hearth, and outside the wind ran along the eaves of the house they'd fixed together, over the porch that didn't sag anymore, above the root cellar that was properly stocked, on the ranch that was smaller than Rowan had hoped it would be by now, and larger than it had been in years. There was no clean road through the fear. He knew that. He'd learned that the hard way, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. What there was, instead, was the choice to walk forward into it with someone beside you instead of alone, and he'd been alone in the hard things long enough to know the difference that made. "We'll be all right," he said. He said it not because he was certain, but because he meant to try with everything he had, and he thought she understood the distinction. She squeezed his hand once and let go. "Yes," she said. "We will." The pregnancy was not easy. Evelyn was sick through November, badly enough that the mornings were a considerable project just in themselves, and she was furious about it in the quiet, internal way she was furious about things that inconvenienced her. Not complaining, just visibly irritated at her own body's behavior. Rowan picked up the morning work without comment and left her to the later hours when she was steadier. And if she was aware of the adjustment, she didn't address it directly, which was her way of accepting help without having to acknowledge needing it. He didn't push her to rest more than she was willing to. She would have resented it, and he knew her well enough to know that being managed, however gently, was something she found difficult, because management had meant something specific and damaging in her previous life. He helped where she let him help and tried to notice the line. Clara came for 2 weeks in December, which turned out to be exactly right. She was practical in the way that actually useful people were practical. Not hovering or anxious, just present and capable, picking up tasks without announcement and applying her particular brand of stubborn competence to keeping the household running while Evelyn's energy was unreliable. She and Evelyn had developed, by this point, a relationship that wasn't exactly friendship, but was something with genuine warmth in it. Two women who respected each other's competence and had found, after the initial months of careful assessment, that they fundamentally liked each other. On Clara's last evening, the three of them sat at the kitchen table after supper, the winter dark full outside the windows, and Clara said to Evelyn, "My brother has not been this present in years." Evelyn looked at him sideways. "I'm not sure what to do with that." "Accept it as a compliment," Clara said. "It is one." "I'm sitting right here," Rowan said. "I know," Clara said. "That's what I mean." He looked at his sister, who was smiling in the way she smiled when she was genuinely happy about something. And he looked at Evelyn, who was watching him with the quiet, settled attention she gave to things she loved. And he thought about a telegram that had sat on a kitchen table for 11 days, and a man who had driven to a train station telling himself it was for lamp oil and a harness buckle. The choices that changed things didn't always announce themselves as choices. Sometimes they looked like avoidance and procrastination, and a man who couldn't quite bring himself to stay home. Sometimes the thing you thought you were refusing was actually the thing you couldn't stop moving toward. He looked down at his coffee. "I'm glad you arranged it," he said to Clara. He didn't say it easily. It cost him something, because he was who he was. But he said it. Clara blinked. In 38 years, she had never once heard him volunteer that kind of thing without being pushed. "Well," she said, after a moment. "You're welcome." Evelyn said nothing. But when he looked at her, the corner of her mouth had moved in a way that told him she knew exactly what that had cost him, and that she was pleased. The baby came in April, the same month the previous year had brought the mud in the drainage trench and the first real breaking of winter. It seemed right, somehow, that a new beginning would arrive in the season that the land itself used for the same purpose. The labor was long and difficult, and Rowan spent most of it outside the bedroom door doing things with his hands that didn't need doing, reorganizing the medicine shelf, checking the water supply, splitting wood that didn't need splitting, because being useless in a situation where something he loved was at risk was the specific variety of helpless that he found hardest to endure. Ruth Henderson had come to help. She had 3 children of her own and had attended enough births in the area to be the closest thing to qualified available within a reasonable distance. She came out of the bedroom twice to update him, and both times her face told him things were going the way they were supposed to go, which helped somewhat. The third time the door opened, it was just Ruth, and she said, "Come in." The baby was in Evelyn's arms, wrapped in the muslin they'd prepared. Evelyn was exhausted in a way that showed on her face without apology. She'd stopped performing wellness the way she used to. She'd let him see her as she actually was, and this was as unguarded as he'd ever seen her. Her hair was completely down, her face was pale and worn, and she was looking at the child in her arms with an expression he couldn't read entirely. But that was somewhere between wonder and the specific tenderness of someone encountering something entirely new. She looked up when he came in. "He's all right," she said. Her voice was rough. "He's fine." Rowan came to the side of the bed and looked at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and scrunched and had a remarkable amount of dark hair and was making a small complaining sound that seemed to be directed at the general situation of having arrived. He sat on the edge of the bed and didn't say anything for a moment. "He looks angry," he finally said. Evelyn made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. "He's entitled. Can I—" She transferred the baby to him with the careful precision of someone who had been holding something breakable and was trusting another person with it. He settled the weight in his arms. That specific weight, that specific smallness, which he had not held in 4 years. And something in his chest did what it did, the complicated thing that grief and love and time all shared the same territory for, and he let it do it without fighting it. He looked down at his son and thought about Thomas, briefly and completely, the way you thought about someone you'd lost when the present was so full of something new that it made the loss more acute and more bearable at the same time. Thomas had had his mother's eyes. This one was too new to tell whose eyes he had. Thomas had called the horses big dogs. This one didn't have words yet, had nothing yet, was just new and present and alive. He was not a replacement. That was not how it worked. And Rowan had understood that in his bones since the day he'd lost them both, understood that there was no filling that shape, that the shape stayed the shape of what was gone. But you could build alongside it. You could build a new room in yourself and find that the building didn't erase what had been there before. "What do we call him?" he said. He hadn't wanted to decide before. She'd suggested names in the later months and he'd been non-committal, which she'd allowed without pressing. She'd understood, he thought, that he needed to see the child first. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to call him?" He thought about his father, who had held this land before him and written letters to surveyors and never thrown anything away. He thought about the trunk in the back room that had been a mess and was now organized. He thought about a man named Thomas, who had never had the chance to grow into more words. "James," he said, "after my father." She nodded once. "James?" she said, trying the name in her mouth. "James Mercer." She looked at the baby, who had stopped complaining and was now simply existing with the absolute presence that new things had. "That's a good name." Ruth Henderson left in the early evening with the satisfied air of a woman who had done good work. Rowan walked her to her wagon and she squeezed his arm at the gate and said, "She did well." And he said, "I know," and she drove away. He came back inside and stood in the doorway of the bedroom. Evelyn had James in the crook of her arm and was almost asleep, the exhaustion finally claiming her. The lamp on the washstand was burning low. Outside, the April evening was doing what April evenings did when they were honest, clear and cold and full of the sound of the creek running with snowmelt and the horses in the corral and the land settling into its spring work. He thought about October, 14 months ago, the train platform, the woman with the worn suitcase, the man who'd come to the station telling himself lies about lamp oil. People talked about love like it was a thing that arrived, like it was weather that happened to you, something you were in or weren't in, as if the self had nothing to do with it. He didn't believe that anymore. What he believed, what he had learned specifically through the specific education of this specific year, was that love was closer to a practice than a condition. It was the choice to tell the truth to someone. It was the decision to drive to a train station and not leave a stranger standing on an empty platform. It was the willingness to open a box that had been closed for 4 years and say a name out loud. It was the fence line, the drainage trench, the supper table, the cup of coffee in the morning. It was the accumulated weight of every small thing chosen. He had been a man who had stopped choosing. He told himself he was grieving, and he had been genuinely, but there came a point where grief became a habit, and the habit became a wall, and the wall became the whole architecture of your life, and you stopped being someone who had suffered a loss and became someone who was defined by it. Evelyn hadn't rescued him from that. He needed to be clear about that in his own accounting. She hadn't arrived and fixed him the way stories sometimes told it. She had simply lived honestly in his presence, worked alongside him without performing anything, and given him a daily example of what it looked like to be a person who had also been badly hurt and had decided with full knowledge of what it cost to want things anyway. He had made his own choices. That was important. You couldn't borrow someone else's courage and call it yours. But you could be shown that it was possible, and sometimes that was the thing you needed most. He went in and turned down the lamp and sat in the chair by the window while his wife slept and his son slept in his wife's arm. And he stayed there for a long time, not sleeping himself, just present. The mountains were dark against the sky outside. The creek was audible through the window he'd left cracked for the air. The ranch was still a long way from what it could be. There were years of work ahead, and some of those years would be brutal, and some of the work would fail, and there would be losses of various kinds because the frontier didn't give anything away, and the only contract it offered was that difficulty was part of the terms. He knew that. He'd been on this land long enough to know it without illusion, but the house had both of them in it, and now a third, and the list in his head, the long, grinding list of everything that was wrong and needed fixing and hadn't been gotten to, was shorter than it had been in 6 years. Not because everything was solved, because there were 2 of them carrying it. James Mercer grew the way children grew on working ranches, fast and practical, learning the texture of the land before he learned words for it, pulled up onto the saddle in front of his father before he could walk properly, trailing after his mother through the garden and the barn and the root cellar with the focused watchfulness of a child absorbing everything. He had Evelyn's dark eyes and Rowan's jaw and his own particular personality, which emerged early as a combination of stubbornness and observation that made both his parents look at each other sometimes with expressions of rueful recognition. "He gets that from you," Rowan said once, watching James refuse with absolute serene determination to eat something he'd decided he didn't like. "He gets the stubbornness from you," Evelyn said. "He gets the strategic patience from me." "What's the difference?" "Your stubbornness is immediate. Mine waits until the right moment." She glanced at him. "He's going to be more dangerous than either of us." He turned out to be right about that, but that was a story still being written. In the spring of 1885, they expanded the ranch. Not dramatically. Rowan had learned caution about dramatic moves, and Evelyn's numbers always told the truth about what was possible and what was wishful thinking. But they acquired 40 additional acres to the north along the creek, which improved their water security and gave them room for the expanded herd the past 2 summers had made viable. The purchase was documented correctly from the first day, every line of it airtight, because they had both learned what imprecise documentation could cost. Bill Tillman had sold his operation the previous autumn and moved on somewhere. No one seemed to know exactly where. The homesteader Selby had survived 2 more years and was building something real by now, the kind of slow-growing stability that came when you hadn't been pushed off your own land. Rowan didn't know Selby well. They'd spoken twice, but he saw him in town occasionally, and there was a nod between them that meant something without requiring language. The town had come around fully, in the way towns came around when the person they doubted had simply remained and worked and refused to disappear. Eleanor Haskins had long since found other topics of concern. Ruth Henderson had become something like a friend to Evelyn, the kind of friendship that women built on the frontier, and practical and warm and occasionally interrupted by seasons and weather and work, but always resumed where it had left off. Hank Delaney had declared himself James's unofficial uncle at some point, which no one had asked him to do and no one objected to. On a September evening in 1885, Rowan was coming in from the north pasture at the end of a long day. The light was doing what September light did in Montana, going golden and low, stretching the shadows out long across the grass, turning the mountains into something that looked painted rather than real. He was tired in the way of a man who'd done physical work for 10 hours and had that specific satisfaction under the tiredness that was different from exhaustion without purpose. He could see the house from the rise. He saw the light in the kitchen window. He saw Evelyn in the garden with James, the two of them doing something with the late vegetables. She was showing him something, her head bent to his, and James was paying the absolute attention he paid to things he'd decided were worth understanding. He could hear, faintly, the sound of his son's voice asking something, and then his wife's voice answering, and then James laughing at whatever she'd said. He stopped his horse at the top of the rise and just looked at it for a moment. This was what he had lost the night to think about, 4 years ago in the house that had felt like a shell. Not this specifically. He hadn't been capable of imagining this specifically, but the fact of this. The house with the light in it, the voices, the particular weight of a life that was full rather than managed. He had been so certain, for so long, that what he'd lost was the only version of that life available to him. That he'd had it once, and the frontier had taken it, and that was the whole accounting. He had organized his life around that conclusion with the thoroughness of a man who was good at logistics and bad at hope. He'd been wrong. He was glad he'd been wrong. He thought that was worth saying plainly, even just to himself, even just in his own head at the top of a rise in September light. He had been wrong, and being wrong was the best thing that had happened to him in years. He rode down to the gate. James heard the horse and abandoned the garden at a sprint, the way he abandoned everything at a sprint when there was a choice, and came flying across the yard with his boots untied and his hair in every direction. "Papa!" he shouted, with the complete investment of a 3-year-old who had not seen his father since morning and had information to convey. Mama found a big snake in the beans, and she hit it with the hoe, and it went... He produced a sound and a gesture that attempted to convey the snake's trajectory and fell somewhat short. It went very far. Rowan looked over the boy's head at Evelyn, who was walking across the yard with dirt on her hands, and the expression of a woman who had handled a thing and was not going to make more of it than it was. "How big?" Rowan asked. "Not that big," she said. "James has adjusted the scale." "It was very big," James said firmly. Rowan lifted his son onto the horse and held him there in front of the saddle, the way his own father had held him, the way he had once held Thomas, the continuity of it running back and forward at the same time. James immediately began narrating the view from the extra height with the enthusiasm of a person who had discovered a new perspective and intended to use it thoroughly. Evelyn stood at the horse's shoulder and looked up at them, her hand on the bay's neck. The late light was on her face. She was 30 years old now, and the frontier had put its mark on her the way it put its mark on everyone who stayed, weathered at the corners of her eyes, stronger through the shoulders than she'd been when she stepped off that train, a particular quality of settled assurance in her bearing that hadn't been there in the beginning. She was not what she had been, and she didn't try to be. She was better, harder to push over and more sure of where she stood, and more willing to say the difficult thing because she'd learned, slowly and against considerable resistance, that silence about the things that mattered was not a neutral act. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're doing the thing where you don't say what you're thinking." "I was thinking it's a good evening." She looked at him for a moment, the direct look that could still find the honest thing under the surface thing. "Yes," she said. "It is." James, who had heard enough about the evening and wanted dinner, said so at length and without ambiguity, and Evelyn said, all right, and Rowan swung down from the horse and lifted his son off and set him on the ground, and James ran toward the house with his boots still untied. They walked in together. The house was warm and smelled like the late summer vegetables she'd been putting up all week, and the accounts on the table showed a year that was better than the previous one, and the photograph on the bedroom shelf showed a woman who had lived here before, whose absence was still real, would always be real, and whose place in this house was not the same as the life that had grown up around it. Home was not a place you found. Rowan had been here his whole life, had grown up on this land, had buried people he loved in the shadow of these mountains, and he'd had to lose it almost entirely before he understood that. The building was just a building. The acreage was just acreage. What made it the specific weight and warmth that the word home actually meant was the accumulated presence of people who had chosen it and each other, and kept choosing it when the choosing was hard. He had been chosen. That was the thing he came back to, in the end, that he found most difficult to take in and most necessary to accept. Evelyn Cross had stepped off a train into a life that offered her nothing guaranteed, and had looked at the man who hadn't wanted her, and the land that was trying to kill her, and she had said, with full knowledge of what wanting things had cost her before, "I want this." That kind of choosing, the kind that knows the risk and reaches anyway, was not something you could manufacture. You could only recognize it when it stood in front of you and try, with everything you had, to be worth it. He thought he was finally actually trying. James was already at the table demanding to know what was for supper. Evelyn was at the stove, answering him in the patient, direct tone she used with him. The same tone she'd used to settle the gray mare in the barn during the blizzard. The same tone she used when she was telling Rowan something she meant him to hear. Rowan washed up at the basin and sat down at the table, and James climbed into his chair and knocked over his cup immediately, which was so predictable that Evelyn had a cloth ready before the water finished spreading. "Sorry," James said, without noticeable remorse. "I know," Evelyn said. The supper was not exceptional. The evening was not exceptional. It was a ranch family in Montana at the end of a working day in September, eating together in a kitchen that had been repaired and organized and argued in and laughed in, on land that had been bled for and documented and defended, in a life that had been built not from a plan but from a series of choices made by two imperfect people who had each, in their different ways, decided that being alive was worth the risk of losing things. It was ordinary. That was the whole point. It was the ordinary that they'd both, separately, been afraid they'd never have again. Outside, the September dark came down over the mountains. The creek ran in the distance. The horses stood quiet in the corral. The land that had taken so much and given so much in return lay still under a sky full of cold stars, patient and enormous and indifferent in the way it always was, the way it would be long after all of them were gone. But tonight the kitchen window was lit. The voices inside it were real, and that, in the end, was enough.